Good morning, everyone. We have with us Dr. B.N. Hiremath for this session, who is retired senior professor, IRMA Anand, Gujarat, and he will be delivering talk on questionnaire and schedule development. Dr. B.N. Hiremath superannuated from Dhirubhai Ambani Institute of Information and Communication Technology, Gandhinagar, as a professor, and from the Institute of Rural Management, Anand, Gujarat, as a senior professor in 2009. He held faculty positions in Tennessee State University and Fisk University in USA. He has a multiple disciplinary academic background with a PhD in natural resources and environmental economics, MS in rural development, and a master's degree in agronomy and a bachelor's degree in agriculture. Dr. Hiremath has over 35 years of experience in teaching, research, and training. He has taught a variety of courses and specifically research methodology for 22 years. He has completed consulting assignments for many international national institutions and NGOs, and also conducted 50 training programs for various organizations. In addition, he served as management trainee segment coordinator and internship placement coordinators and many more. He worked extensively on livelihood issues related to small and marginal farmers, both in India and United States. I welcome Dr. B.N. Hiremath, sir, for this next session on questionnaire and schedule development. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Welcome to all the participants. Okay. I will be talking for about an hour, approximately an hour, and then we will leave the rest of the time for question answers.
Fine, sir.
I start with this one. My name is B.N. Hiremath, as I already introduced, and I would like to go start with the first slide. First slide, please. Okay. Yeah. Before you start designing a questionnaire or even attempt to do that, the first thing I used to do was visit the study area where I have to collect the data. And to understand the context, it's very important that you understand the context before you design the questionnaire. Because we formulate the project, we have specific objectives. In order to achieve that objectives, we have to sometimes collect data from primary sources. In that context, we have to design the questionnaire. But if you don't understand the context itself, it's very difficult to even attempt to develop a questionnaire. Second thing is very important is before you start, you need to clearly define the objectives. You yourself have to understand what these objectives are. And what I used to do is carry a set of objectives written on a piece of paper every time I visited the field to see to administer a questionnaire. Every half an hour, I used to go and look at the objectives. This is very important because when you lose sight of the objectives, the questions you ask may not be pertinent to the objectives that you are trying to achieve. And therefore, it is, you will have to keep that objective in mind every second when you go into the field. You have to understand the people, you have to understand the locations, you have to understand the whole settings where your research is going to be located. Next slide, please. In this survey research, I talk about the general type of surveys, selecting a survey method, writing survey questionnaires, which is the main aspect of this talk. Next slide, please. Next slide. Type of survey questions. You have three types of questionnaires. One is group administered, second is mail administered, and third is household drop-off. There are several advantages and disadvantages to each of these, But I'm not going to go into the detail, but these are the questionnaires as a part of the survey method. And the second one is, next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. And the interviews, which is personal interviews as well as telephonic interviews. Now, coming to the selecting the survey methods. Next slide, please. There are several issues that one has to consider. First of all, the population issues. And the questions we ask in the population issues is, can the population be enumerated? And especially in the tribal areas, in some of the difficult areas, it's very difficult to enumerate the population itself, and out of which we take a sample. And therefore, the first question is, where is the population located? How difficult is to reach the population? Whether all the units of the population can be surveyed. These are some of the issues. Second is the population literate? Because there is no point in sending a written questionnaire or ask them to fill up the questionnaire if the population is not literate by itself. So the important thing is to find out what kind of population are we dealing with. For this, you need to make the field visits. Third, is language or language going to be an issue? Are there language issues? Many times we end up doing research in areas where we are not familiar with the language, or even if we are familiar with the language, often we will not be able to understand the dialect that particular area has. So, when you design a question, you will have to consider these language issues, because the wording that you choose may or may not be understood by the population or the sample or the individual. Okay. The next question one has to consider is, will the population cooperate? Often we assume that when we go into the field, the population will cooperate, or the people whom we have selected will cooperate. But that's a misnomer. Many times I have worked in the field where the people were not willing to talk to us at all, either because their rapport was not there, or they suspected us, or there may be any number of reasons that the population may or may not cooperate with you. And these issues had to be very seriously taken when designing a questionnaire. The next is the geographical restrictions. Often when we do research, we work under time limitations. It's easy to sit in the office and say per day we'll complete 15 to 20 questionnaires, and without any problem. So we'll need so many days to complete such an, the sample size of either 100 or 200 or something like that. These are theoretical calculations that we make in sitting in the office. But once you visit those geographical areas, you will be more realistic in making an assessment of the time that is required to reach from one place to another, one household to another household. And these may be hilly areas, these may be tribal areas where the households are scattered all over the place. They are not, may not be in a conventional village where all the households are located in one single small geographical area. Next slide, please. Then there are sampling issues. What data is already available about the population? Do we have the addresses for all the people? Do we have the telephone numbers if we are going to conduct a telephonic interview? Can we locate these addresses? Because often what happens is the addresses may be correct, but the season in which we are going, in the rural areas, many times the households migrate to urban areas for looking for odd jobs. So therefore, the timing of the survey and other things, we will come to know only if you visit this locality where your research is located. Can the respondents be found? This is a big question. Sometimes, yes, you go, they're at home, You can do the interviews, and sometimes you find the doors locked. And especially in tribal areas where the houses are located far apart, you will find you go there, walk for half an hour, 40 minutes to reach the another household, and finally you just find the door is locked. These kinds of circumstances can be avoided if you visit the area, understand the locality, their culture, their when they their livelihoods in totality before you design the questionnaires. And the next question sampling issue is, who is the respondent? Uh, Many times I've seen, when I was doing a research project on the dairy related issues, and most of the time the respondents were happened to be men, but the real respondent, the people who took care of the animals, milking, feeding, and every other uh, operations in the dairy industry, were done by women. So when you ask men about the dairying, you will get men's perspective on dairying, not the women's perspective at all, who actually manages the dairy. So therefore, the choice of respondent becomes very critical. Now, many times we talk to somebody who is ready to answer the questions. Often it may be head of the household, and usually people go and talk to the head of the household because he's the most senior person, but he may not be the relevant person for a particular type of research with particular objectives. And therefore, one has to identify the right respondent to fill up the questionnaires. It cannot be any member of the households. Children can be, children's perspective may be different about the same issues, while female members' issues may be different and male members' perspectives may be different. There are other kind of respondents which can be groups or agencies, among many other things. Next slide, please. Sampling issues, or can all members of the population be sampled, or only a part of the population can be sampled? What are there any problems that we will encounter with the response rates? This is especially true when you send a mail order questionnaire uh, or a house drop-in questionnaire. Often the response rates, if you get about 30 to 35%, you will be lucky. Many times these response rates are very low, and especially if you are, if it's a long questionnaire, people do not like to spend too much time answering their personal or professional uh, questions that you ask them. Next, please. Now, there are also question issues. What kind of questions can you ask? Are the questions going to be complicated? If they're going to be complicated, will people understand? Will screen questions be necessary? Can questions be sequenced? Sequence can be controlled? Will there be lengthy questions to be asked? Question response scales, long response scales be used? All these kinds of issues one has to consider when designing a questionnaire. Because ultimately, when you go into the field, if you don't consider these questionnaires, we will have a very disappointing result. Next, please. Uh, Content issues of the questionnaire, can respondents be expected to know about the issue? Because when we design questions according to our perspectives, and which we expect that the respondent will know the answers to this. But that is sometimes it's not correct. The respondents are expected to know the issues, yes, no. If they are not, then you don't include those in the questionnaires. Will respondents need to consult records? Often we collect farm management kind of data where we have to look at the costs and returns and other things, the quantities. Often the recall method is not sufficient. Therefore, they may have to consult records in order to answer some of the questions. These kind of considerations are important when you design the content of the questionnaires. Next, please. Bias issues. Can social desirability be avoided? This is very important because often when we are talking to the, in the field, my experience has been when there are people sitting there, we are dealing with a lower social status people. They don't answer the questions in front of the other upper, social upper caste people. And therefore it becomes a problem. Anytime you say any question, they'll say, साहूकार को पता है, साहूकार को पता है, उनसे पूछ लीजिए. And therefore, one of the things is, how do we avoid these kinds of social, biases when the in the questionnaire? And other, problem we frequently encounter is interviewers' distortion of questions, submersion. Can it be controlled somehow? Because I've seen many a times that the questions you have meticulously prepared the questionnaire. You hire some of the enumerators. They go into the field. They don't ask the questions the way it should be asked. They change the wordings in order to make the respondent understand, or sometimes they put the answer in the mouth of this one. These results in distorted data that you will ultimately end up with. Can false respondent be avoided? This is very common problem that we encounter when you conduct surveys. I have seen many times that if the person respondent is not alone, the person sitting next to him or her will start answering the questions, and these are false respondents that has to be avoided. Many times, therefore, when we collect the data from questionnaire using the questionnaires, if there are two people, one of them we go in pairs. We collect the data in two of us go. One of them asks the questions, and if we find there is somebody else responding to it, you somehow very carefully you take them the false respondent away so that we get to talk to the true respondent. Next, please. And there are many administrative issues that we can't even think of. The cost, the time, facilities that are needed to conduct interviews, the personnel required, how much, what kind of training they have, uh, whether they have that bias issues and other things that we talked about, are there time constraints? All these kinds of things will have to be taken into consideration before you, get into the questionnaire design. Next one, please. Now coming to the main topic, that is the questionnaires, design of questionnaires. And we will be talking about several three sub sections of this. Next one, please. What type of questions? Types of questions. Guidelines for question writings are decision about question content. How do we carefully design considering the question content? Design about questionnaire wording. Design about response format and placement and sequencing of questions. Excuse me. Next one, please. These are something that all of you are maybe familiar with, I'm sure. Type of questions, structured and unstructured. Next one, please. And just to review, we ask questions that are dichotomous, responses. Yes, no, male, female, these kinds of responses you obtain. Two options are there, either one or the other is this. Next one, please. You have structured questions with nominal kind of scales that you use. Occupation, for example, he's a truck driver, lawyer, etc. These are questions that are nominal scale, very limited kind of analysis. It's just a ID kind of a thing. Next one, please. You have questions that are structured questions, which are ordinal in nature, which results in some kind of preferences or ranking. Please rank the candidate Mamta Banerjee, Sidramaya, etc., 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 in the order of from best to worst performing people. So these kinds of questions we normally have. In agriculture, we have several type of these responses, and we have to consider that ultimately the analysis require some kind of this data that is either nominal or ordinal or ratio or whatever. And these are the some of the this one. Next one, please. This is a quick review. Some of them are in interval scale that typically we have these kinds of responses that we questions we ask, and we ask them to kind of evaluate the a particular thing on strongly agree to strongly disagree. This is called the Likert scale. Next one, please. And this is another one, semantic differential scale. We have again some kind of parameters that from interesting, simple, caring, useful are some of the variables, and these are ranked from very interesting to very boring, very simple to very complex, caring to very uncaring, these kinds of things, where the respondents are asked to kind of tick mark the thing. For example, in this interesting, uh, yes, this particular lecture is very interesting or very much boring. These are kind of a thing that uh, uh, data we collect for various purposes and for various types of analysis depending the objectives. Next one, please. And there are also structured questions with the interval scale, which Gutman scale is another one of the examples, cumulative scale. For example, that you ask questions with some kind of intensity. How are you willing to permit immigrants live in your country? This is a very broad general questions. From there, you go narrow it down and ask, are you willing to permit migrants in your community? From country, you come to the community. From community, you come to the neighborhoods. And from neighborhood, you come to your neighbor. And finally, it comes to a point where say, would you have your child marry an immigrant? This is kind of from very broad to narrowed down to a very, very, very narrow kind of situation. The responses given by in this case may vary from person to person based on the perceptions they have. Okay, next one, please. Now, sometimes we need questions to filter, which are called filter questions or contingency questions, just to determine whether we are picking up the right candidate for the interview. For example, if you are, my research has been always on small farmers. The first thing I look at is whether the farmer that I'm going to talk to is a small farmer or not, whatever the definition of the small farmer is. Okay. The first question after the preliminary exchange of pleasantries, we start with something very casually and say, how much land do you own? And he says, I have 10 acres. That automatically means we should not go further and collect data from him. So therefore, the first questions are screening questions. And many times these screening questions may come in the middle of the questionnaire or even at the end of the questionnaire. Nonetheless, these are important questions because at some point in time, you have to either stop the interview or you have a good chance of, if you collect it, it may dilute your the quality of the data. Next one, please. And suppose the answer to that question, then you have to, if it says yes, then the next is a follow-up question. You want to, you don't want to, collect data from whoever has smoked once or twice. So you need to kind of further break down the contingency questions to identify the more relevant kind of a targeted population, okay, targeted sample. So you need these kinds of questions. And next one, please. When you develop this filter or contingency questions, you have to avoid having more than 3 levels. You don't keep on saying that, no, oh, yes, I smoke marijuana, and then he smokes 3 times a week. And then you go further and have another 2 questions just to eliminate the, no, the, this one, a false kind of sampling. If two or more level uh, are used, then you have to have graphic, arrow and boxes. And if possible, you have to jump to the new page. Sometimes we do that. If if you don't have this particular quality, then jump to page such and such, and then it's a new set of questions that you will be uh, asking. And sometimes it is you continue with this next page, next page, next page. Yeah, next. Now, decisions about question content. Here it is very important that this content should directly relate to the objectives of the research. In fact, it is each objectives will have a set of questions, and the content of each question one has to ask, do I need this question at all? What is it going to, how is it going to help me achieve the objectives that I've started with? Next one, please. Now, is the question necessary or useful? That's what I was talking about. Because often we tend to have a lot of questions. We, I have over the years, I've seen that about 70 to 80% of the data that we collect, we don't use in either our projects or our consulting with this one assignments, or sometimes in our thesis also. We collect almost 40 to 50% of the questions that need not be asked, and that only complicates matters. Now, many times I've seen that people are, design the questionnaires with nicely looking columns and rows that have, each family member's name, age, relationship, etc., etc., education, etc. And every question is asked, everything is filled up, and finally, when it comes to analysis, we don't even look at it. We may look at it, how many children are there, of a certain age and above, or below certain age. These kinds of things we end up collecting, and often we don't use those details in our analysis at all. So do we need to ask income, or can you estimate? Income is a sensitive subject. When you talk to farmers, at least in my experience has been, both both in India, in various parts of India, and in the United States, I always see that the expenses and exceeding the incomes. Now, this is for whatever reasons, there is an overestimate on the on expenses and underestimate of incomes when you ask questions about the income. So one of the things we need to do is, when you are talking about it, it's also a sensitive questions, especially when you are working with the educated population. Nobody would like to give you their exact incomes, the sources of income, etc. And also income is, so what kind of income are you talking about? Gross income, net income, all these kinds of things crop up when we are collecting the questionnaires. When you talk about the contents, are we interested in gross incomes, net incomes, incomes from agriculture alone, incomes from household income? There are various kinds of income one has to look at, and the question should reflect these kinds of differences in related to income. Next one, please. Now, when we ask questions, sometimes we end up having a very general type of questions, which is very difficult to interpret the answers to that are given. So if they are too general, do we need to break them down into smaller questions? Or, if can we combine the two questions content wise, one at a time is the rule. You ask the question in such a way where only one issue is dealt with in each of the questions. For example, what are your feelings towards BJP and Congress? Now, there are two parties. They should be two separate questions. What happens is, if you say that, in one single question, we ask two issues, the people get confused. You get answers that are so difficult to interpret. Sometimes you don't know whether they're talking about BJP or they're talking about Congress. This happens all the time when you ask open-handed questions. And another example is, about the benefits and hours of employment or changes in employment. What do you think about the proposed changes in benefits? That should be a separate question. What do you think about the proposed change in hours? Many times, we have been, if you are familiar with, there was once upon a time 6 days a week, 5.5 days a week, 5 days a week, these kinds of things. Uh, the benefits also varies, all these kinds of issues. They are two separate issues. What do you think of the benefits? You ask as a separate question. And what do you think about the changes in hours? So these kinds of issues, one has to consider very carefully. While wording, one has to be very specific. So we get pure, targeted data. Next one, please. Now, if you ask about earnings, might not mention all the income. One, I have already told you that there may be income from savings, income from investments. These things may not be this one unless you ask them very specific questions. In such cases, you need multiple kind of questions, several questions to get the total earnings. Next one is the ask. There is a tendency we ask, what is the, if you are in favor of the Doordarshan, for example, public television, what is you? If you are in favor of, who are you referring to as you? Is it your wife, female, male, children? Because there are television shows that, for every age group, and people watch, men watch sports, women watch some other household kind of programming. So there are various things. So one has to be very cautious about asking very general questions. In such cases, several questions will be required. Next one, please. Now, sometimes we ask questions, what is which political party you support? What do you think about Hindus, etc.? These kind of questions often assume certain things. When you ask a question about Hindus, without asking questions about their religion, their attitude towards religion, it is very difficult to interpret. First, you need to understand whether what is their attitudes towards religion, and then come to this one. What do what is their attitude towards Hindus or Muslims or Christians or Jains or whatever? These are some of the things that we have to consider while designing the questionnaires. Next one, please. Survey instruments. These are similar examples. Next one, please. One of the things about questionnaire content is, do the respondents have the needed information? I'm giving you this example. I was watching this Ramana in this lockup period, although it was an old serial. Uh, what do you think about whether Arun Goyal acted correctly in Ramayana? This is a question. We have the tendency to ask these kinds of questions, but the respondent cannot say if they don't know who Arun Goyal is. So they don't have the needed information. Although they might have watched the show Ramayana, but if they don't know who Arun Goyal is, they can't respond. So once sometimes we assume that everybody knows the who has acted in Ramayana or something, which is our assumptions, which may not hold correct when we are designing a questionnaire. TV surveys, regular watchers can be asked about program content. Those people who have never watched should not be asked those kind of questions. These are some cautions that one has to exercise when they are designing the questionnaire, question contents. Next one, please. Uh, Sometimes we have a tendency to ask questions that are not very specific. Generally, for example, when I was interviewing for some, students for admission and these kinds of things, we generally ask, which book do you read? Did you like the book? Uh, People come prepared for these interviews. Yes, sir, I have read this book by this author. Can you name one or two books of it then? Yeah, they have memorized all answers. They will give you those answers. Is that what you want? Now, how the general questions will not help us. But if the person is this one, if he has really liked the book, how many people have you recommended this to? And more specifically, you can ask if you have you read any other books from these same authors. So here, what we are looking at is one of is to kind of avoid memorized answers. Second, that we are trying to see that he's telling the truth. The person is responding to truthfully, and there's and whether he likes it so much that it can be generalized, he can ask others to read. These kind of issues that one has to consider while designing the questionnaires. Yeah, next one. Uh, these are sometimes we tend to use the without defining this one. It's general, for instance, seasonal specificity. If you ask what do they usually watch, uh, and it's summertime, if you will get a different answer if you ask it is the same question in the winters. So sometimes you have to be very specific about season. When is it? Right now the rainy season is almost about to end. The price now of commodities are probably going to be coming down for a while, and then they will start going up once the season gets over. So when we are talking about specific crops and prices and other things, one has to be specific about the time period which they're talking about. Even when we are watching TV also, often Saturday Sundays people watch sports, and therefore when you are talking about again in a seasonality, we are looking at specific days of the week. Similarly with to the seasons, what do you watch on Saturdays, Sundays? uh, Men who are working often don't get time to watch shows, uh, and they are mostly interested in sports, and therefore some of even during the day, the hours of the day, you find sports usually having in the evenings or something they may watch, therefore you get a different kind of a response. So these are things that are related to time specific. It's not necessarily seasonal in nature, but even within a day, morning, afternoon, evening, these are some of the things. By gender wise they may differ. Yes. Next one, please. Sometimes we ask question, Often, you know, because of ignorance, sometimes also we want to be biased with a, with a particular view of ours, and we ask design questions in such a way that bias enters into the questionnaire. Ask about benefits of tax cut without asking about the disadvantage. Now, this is usually happens uh, when two parties, opposition parties, and the ruling party are there. The opposition parties always looks at ways to counter the what the ruling party is doing. Ruling party talks about mostly the benefits of the tax cut, or tax increase, or whatever it is. But the opposition will always find loopholes because the other party is looking at this one. So these are the kind of biases each party has in politics, of course. And often we also look at, sometimes we don't, we try to hide some of the things and only bring out uh, the good things in the surveys. Uh, Similarly, you are talking about, what are the disadvantages of eliminating some particular welfare program without asking the benefits. These are some of the kind of things that we normally deal with, and one has to be extremely careful uh, when dealing with such things. Okay, next one, please. There are several times that the respondents, whether they youth answer truthfully. Uh, Often in our culture, probably it's not so much of a big problem, but in asking a woman's age, for example, becomes an issue, or directly asking income, how much do you earn? Okay, therefore, once when you design a questionnaire, often the response format should be in the in groups. Like the example, I belong to the 20 to 30 year group, or 30 to 40 year group, or whatever it is. And once sometimes you ask the people, yes, how much you have donated to charities or whatever, and people don't, even if they have not donated anything, but in order to kind of show off, they'll say, I donated 5,000 rupees, 5,000. These are typical responses. But once how do you handle this actually? In such cases, you will have to, be very diplomatic and say, normally you have a lot of friends, and or in some situations that you'll have to make donation. How much do you generally your friends make a donation? Is the kind of a, uh, indirect way of knowing the donations, and often that is closer to the truth than when directly asking how much did you donate. Okay. Uh, you ask a lot of times in the interviews, you ask, what magazines do you read? They will give you a list of but when you go to the home, when you're doing the interview, you ask them verbally, what magazines do you subscribe to? They'll tell you one or two. Then if you offer to buy those ones, the used ones, they will not have. So these are some questions that lead to a biased responses, and are not truthfully this one coming out of the respondents. Next one, please. This is another important part of the questionnaire design, the wording of the questionnaires. Next one. Sometimes we use terminologies that are not very clear. What we think and what it means to others may not be the same thing. Can questions be misunderstood? Now, sometimes nationality becomes a very vague uh, definition or concept. Similarly, marital status is another vague concept. Yeah, they are too vague. Questions about mass media is too general. They are likely to be misunderstood. When you talk about mass media, are you talking about print media, Are you talking about this television or radio? Or there are several ways. Today you have, all the modern technologies. We have various kinds of medias that are that are used now. And which one are you talking about? Mass media is a very, very too general a term, and one has to be careful when they are using such terminologies. They're likely to be misunderstood, and therefore the response we get can vary, to extremes. Another example, whatever in a headache remedy you use is an example. It's likely to be misunderstood. Some people may say, I'm using aspirin or this and that. Or some people, I use these capsules, I use this, pills, tablets, etc., etc. One has to be extremely, pinpointed, to get the right kind of answers. In what form is it typically, do you use, put a multiple choice, tablets, capsules, uh, whatever, liquids, whatever it is, etc. Okay. Next one, please. What assumptions the question makes? This is sometimes the question that we ask assumes that there are certain things that people know, or the certain terminologies people are familiar with. If you ask what social class someone belongs to, you assume that they know about the social class. What social class means, what are the various social classes that are classified, etc. We assume that they know those, this one. And what they think, whether they will be able to see which particular social class they could place themselves in. So these are some of the things that we cannot assume, because once you assume, they will get false results. And often, we'll have to check the assumptions in the previous question, whether similar kind of things have occurred. Okay. And these are some of the things one has to very carefully look into. Next one, please. Is time frame specified? Questions often without time frame can lead to a very, funny answers. If you ask the question, whether the government will cut taxes, yes, sometimes they can, they will, sometimes they won't. Or when are they going to cut? We don't know. It may be 3 years from down the line, 5 years down the line, or maybe next, in the 6 months. Or do you think the government will successfully resist tax cuts? When are we talking about? In the next 6 months? In the next 1 year? These kinds of things one has to be, when the wording of questionnaires, one has to be very specific in order to get the responses that we are looking for. If the question is not specific, be sure that you will not get a specific response from the respondents. Next one, please. Uh, Sometimes we tend to use very general wording, and sometimes we have to use very personal kind of wordings in the questionnaires. Now, if you ask, are the working conditions or are satisfactory in your college or in your university or in the plant you work with, where you are working? What do you mean by working conditions satisfactory? Are the working conditions satisfactory? It is too general. For whom is the question? Do you feel that the working conditions are satisfactory or not satisfactory in the plant where you work in? The word, again, you are becoming a little bit more specific. And finally, are you personally satisfied with the working conditions in the plant where you work? personally satisfied, generally satisfied, and working conditions. These are three kind of which are from very specific to very general, or from top to bottom. They are very very general to very specific. So here the sometimes it refers to a person that you are interviewing. Sometimes it refers to the general uh, context in which a person is working. So one has to be very carefully choose the words, whether you are looking for general conditions or specific conditions, general responses or specific responses. Next one, please. Now, people who have been in wars, uh, sometimes direct question is too hurting for the person who is the respondent. How do you feel about the being in the war? Is too direct a question. Often it evokes memories in the minds of the respondents who have been in war, that are sometimes very violent and very it's very personal type of questions, and they are too direct. Now, instead of it, if you say, how well did the equipment hold up in the battlefield? How well were the new recruits trained? These are much more not direct, but it comes to indirect kind of a questions, but refers to the same topic of being in war. So this is the how we manipulate the wordings in order to be very specific, or get towards the more general kind of questions. This is very important that now, depending on the situation, one has to manipulate with the words to suit the respondent, as well as the when I get the information from the point of view of a researcher. Next one, please. Does question content contain difficult or unclear terminologies? Now, this question, this is something that I have been, struggling with for a long, long, long time. We have been taught in agriculture colleges the classification of soils, the types of soils, and all sorts of things that we have our own terminologies that are highly technical, and they are universal, no doubt about it. The terminologies can be understood by agriculture graduates, not only in India, but in the US or anywhere else you talk about. So there is no difficulty among the educated people. Now, uh, when we use our terminologies to ask questions, it is surely being misinterpreted by different people, especially uneducated farmers, or some people who have no agricultural technical background. It becomes a problem. Now, I was in a tribal area, we were working. We asked, what kind of soils you have? Uh, this was a very, what kind of soils means, are we talking about color? Because these are open-ended questions, so they were allowed to speak freely, describe the soil or whatever it is. But then they didn't understand our said, our terminologies. Then they started saying, this one, it was a patrila jameen. That means stony, this one. And patrila jameen is not familiar with to us, especially where people like me who don't know Gujarati. If I'm working in the field, and if I try to use my terminologies, I refer, understand their terminologies and try to compare with mine, this will be, it's uncomparable. They have their own terminologies, uh, because there is a tree, gooseberry tree, they call it Amla Walu Jameen. Now, Amla Walu Jameen, they have their own definition. But unless we understand their terminologies, we cannot ask questions that with our terminology. This is one of the major issues that I have encountered. And even when we talk about something like when we are working on a project on livelihoods, we try to understand what is the definition of livelihood, and which is the term that closely resembles their concept of livelihoods and matches with ours. So it took us almost 6 months, excuse me, almost 6 months to identify the terminology. Leave alone, we asking a questionnaire from our terminology, but the concept has to be matched between the respondents and the researchers thing. So these are some problems that we encounter in the field. But finally, when we talked and talked and talked and talked for about a 6 months period, over a 6 months period, we found out that you know it's a very simple thing. What they said was what do they call? Uh, excuse me. Uh, Ghar chalane, Ghar chalana, which captures the definition of what we had in mind, which encompasses several dimensions, including social, economic, no, and personal, spiritual dimensions, etc., etc., etc. So the wording has to we have to understand their wording and include those wording in our questionnaires. We will get better responses. Jivan Chalana, let the life go, to keep the life going, is the what it means. And livelihoods are exactly that's what we had in mind. So this is kind of a thing with when we design questionnaires, often we are not clear about the terminology that we are using and what they are this one. So one has to, this is where it becomes very critical, that I told you before designing the questionnaire, you have to visit uh, the research area, understand the terminologies, understand the context and other things. That's very important. Sometimes we have questions that we ask, and I, we don't have all the alternatives mentioned in there. So one has to be extremely cautious about that. We have to, as far as possible, we have to make an exhaustive list of alternatives that may be the this one. And are there any objectionable wordings? This happens all the time because what we a particular terminology or word in one language is very much acceptable, but in some other languages, the same word is not very acceptable, and this creates a lot of problems. And wording, whether we are loaded or slanted or all these things, one has to be cautious when designing the question. Yes, next one, please. Response formats is another thing. How do we record the answers to the questions that we are getting? Okay, next one. One is you have the check boxes, check the answers. Dichotomous questions, yes, no, multiple choice. Scales we have already discussed in the beginning. And these are some of the, whether we have designed a question which has dichotomous answers, multiple choice answers, scales or whatever, then we'll have to design the response formats according to those. One has to, when there are open-ended questions, it's a free answer. One has to either tape record it or take the gist of the answers, note it down. And we have to, often when we are asking the open-ended questions, we'll have to follow it up with a lot of questions. So one has to carefully think about it, because when you're conducting such a, open-ended question type of things, one has to go deeper and deeper and deeper. Often we get swayed away, either the response we will not keep the objectives in mind and it gets fade away, we will not be able to accomplish our objectives. One has to keep the answers in check, and we have to check the answers by follow-up questions. Next one, please. Uh, if checklists are all alternatives covered, is the questionnaire of reasonable length? Is the wording impartial? One has to be second time, third time, one has to go through over the questionnaires, each question, each word, and try to answer these, for ourselves. Is the response form easy? Is it uniform, etc.? Next one. Question placement and sequencing is another important part of it. Next one, please. Placement, is the answer influenced by prior questions? We tend to avoid this as much as possible because often there is a break that we have to take when we shift one topic to another, or sometimes when we have a question, follow-up questions that come in that is influenced by the questions that we asked in the prior, 2 or 3 questions prior to that. So one has to be very carefully consider these kinds of things. Sometimes the questions come too early or too late to arouse interest. Often our experience has been, and probably most of you also are, experienced that often the interest is very high during the early stages of the interview, barring the first 10 minutes, 15 minutes, where the rapport is not very well built. But once it takes off, the both parties, especially the respondents, are keen to answer the questions, and therefore you have to use that middle period to ask the critical information that you want to, the questions that generate the critical information to meet your objectives, and that's when you do that. If it's too early, they are nervous, they're in a hurry to uh, wind up the interview, or if it's too late, it has they will not they are tired, or they don't want to answer, they want to just finish the interview. These kinds of situations do arise, and I have seen it any number of times. Does the question receive sufficient attention? If not, somehow we will have to in some cases I have to go to the same person 3 times in order to get some answers to some of the questions. One has to be extremely careful about this, because if there doesn't receive sufficient information, uh, the farmer is trying to get rid of you as quickly as possible. Okay, next one, please. Opening questions. Usually we have introductions and then very easy questions, to start with. This happens in all the interviews and all kind of things. We start with easy questions. We don't should ask very sensitive kind of information in the beginning, because that will discourage the participants from respondents from answering this one. They get a little bit jittery about it. Should the once the respondent gets rolling, we have built some level of trust, and then we then start with the main questions that we want this one, which are very important, which yield us critical information. Next one, please. This is the same thing. Easy, start with easy, non-threatening questions. More difficult questions should be near the end. Never start mail survey with an open-ended questionnaire questions, because that is a discouraging factor when they have to write long answers, or this one. And if possible, unless it's needed for screening, put the demographic type of questions at the end. Okay, next one, please. Historical demographic follow chronological order, ask one topic at a time, don't mix issues, two issues or multiple issues in a single question. When switching topics, use transition. This is important because you have when the interviews or in the questionnaire we are asking questions. When we are finished with crop, one particular crop, instead of asking then questions about the next crop, or when you are from crops to animal, this one uh, animal enterprises, when we want to change the topics, we need to use a small break or 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and that gives us the there should be some completely disconnect between the previous topic and this topic, and therefore it's important that use a transition. This one, reduce response sets as much as possible. For a filter or contingency questions, we make flow charts, which I have already discussed earlier. Next one, please. And before you do the actual survey, before you actually start designing a questionnaire, you have to visit the field. Now you have completed the questionnaire, designed, looking at content issues, sequencing issues, wording issues, and everything else. Now you have to go to the field, test it. It is very important, because there you will notice if the wordings have to be changed, the content have to be, modified. These are some things when you actually test the questionnaires, you will come to know. And every time I have designed a questionnaire, I have gone, I visited the field, I have at least collected 8 to 10 test questionnaires in the actual field settings, where we invariably found that some questions were misunderstood, the terminologies were not correct, and these we had to sit down with the farmers, discuss with them, and reword the questionnaire, change the sequence. These are some things that it points out to. This testing in the field. Modify the questionnaire content, wording, sequencing, etc., based on the test, and then you finalize it. Now the question is ready for final administration. Okay. Next one, please. Most important rule: keep the questionnaire as short as possible. The more the length, the lengthier the questionnaire, the more inaccuracies will enter into the responses. Thank you. Thank you. That's the end of the presentation. And the discussion is open.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a very, very nice presentation, and you have delivered a very good topic, sir. And we have received a number of questions from the participants.
Yes,
So,
please.
sir, do you want to take a break of 2 minutes, or shall I ask the questions?
I think I'll just have a gulp of water and I'll back.
Yeah, that's okay, sir. So we can wait for 2 minutes, and then he will be back to answer your questions.
Yes, I'm back.
Yes, sir. So, sir, I'll start asking the questions. The first one is, you have talked about dichotomous questions.
Yes.
So, how much proportion of the questions should be dichotomous? Because we have always found that Whenever there is dichotomous question, then the drawing of inference from that is very difficult in the last.
Yes.
So what should be the proportion of questions? How to decide that, okay, up till this point I can have dichotomous question and then I'll put other questions?
Uh, it all depends on the type of research you're doing. There are some analysis which uses only dichotomous questions. Okay, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no.
Yeah.
And in such cases, you will have a large number of, almost 80% of maybe dichotomous questions. There is no specific rule in this one. That, what is the, what type of hypothesis you have generated? What is the kind of questions that enable you to do the analysis? Okay. And therefore the questionnaire comes, then you will decide whether it should be a dichotomous questions or multiple choice questions or some other question. There is no specific, at least in my 20 years of experience, I've seen all types of questionnaires where you have a mixture of, this one, some are dichotomous and some are, multiple choice and other kind of formats. Okay.
Yes, sir. So there is no
And
set
there is nothing
format
as
for that.
proportion.
Okay.
It all depends on the objectives. If in a lot of times we ask, do you prefer this or that, or when you have or in between, you have only two choices. Okay, so the preferences. So I don't have any specific recommendations for that, but one has to be, it depends on individual studies and the type of analysis they are trying to do based on the objectives they have. So it all depends on that. Okay.
Okay, sir. Yeah. So the next question is how to validate the sample that represents the population statistically. Is there any method that whatever sample we are drawing is a true representative of the population?
That was the previous next topic that is going to come up with sampling.
Okay.
Actually, let me put it this way. The whole research we are doing is taking a sample from the population, representative sample. Okay. Now, it may be a single sampling method. It may be multiple sampling methods, a combination of various kinds of things. These are possibilities. Okay. Now, what is the objective finally? In all research, hypothesis testing, causal research, I mean, the idea is to study the population. You cannot study the entire population. We take a sample. If you have taken the sample very, correctly, it represented the population. We collect information and we try to generalize our results back to the population. Okay, that's called external validity. How far are we from the truth? The truth we are trying to is, use the sample to find out the truth and then generalize back to the population. Okay. So in that way, in that sense, sampling is a means to select a representatives, population for the study. We cannot study the entire population. Is that the question that you asked?
Yes, sir. I was asking the same question. Okay. So another question is how to balance negative and positive questions so as to check whether the farmers are giving right answer or not. Like they always give it one-sided answer. Sab bekar hai, sab koi bhi cheez ho nahi rahi hai. So how to balance those negative and positive questions?
That is, I told you about, I talked about it, whether they are giving you the truthful results or not. These are some things, one has to, this one. We'll have questions, the same question in a different, altogether different way, which is disguised in a way. And we compare that question with this question and see the correlation, whether there is any correlation or not. So that way one has to we test whether the information that is given to us is truthful or not. There are various ways actually to do that. We ask questions in different forms about the same topic. and see the answers, whether compare the answers. And if we think that there is a discrepancy, that means somewhere we have a problem about the truthfulness of answering the person, this one, the person's whether he's answering truthfully or not. And there is no way we can balance it. One has to
Okay.
include some, check type of questions, double questions and double checking questions.
Okay. Okay, sir. I'll move to the next question. Biasness can be from either side, maybe from the enumerator or from the respondents. So how it should be handled? What are the appropriate solution for any case? Like,
If you are conducting a field survey yourself, your own biases could, be there. One has to train oneself. There is no other, this one. What we did, at least when there is a large projects that we have, we're involved doing, something like 800 to 1,500 samples, 2,000 samples. I've done it for the World Bank. I have done it for National Dairy Development Board, and also some, this German development banks. We had to do field surveys. One thing is, when you design a questionnaire, you first visit the area, you understand, at least, you have a perspective of the ground level realities. You have designed the questionnaire, you have implemented the questionnaire, and then you have the results. When you get the results back, you analyze it, you go back to the field, and then you present the results to the field. And when you present the results in the field, what you are doing is you are incorporating your biases in interpreting the results, the data. And if when we have a discussion, I said, for example, we conducted, surveys in 7 different districts of Madhya Pradesh. And when we presented the results after we had, done the analysis, this is what the data you gave us. This is what we analyzed it. And this is how, we have come up with, these are the things that we are interpreting in this way. What do you think about it? Now, our interpretation were correct up to a 50%. 50% the explanation came from the farmers. They said, "Aisa nahi hai saab, aisa hai." The bias can enter from the respondent side. Bias can enter from the researcher side. For example, I'll give you one example. In the tribal areas of Gujarat, I'm talking specifically in Valsad district. In the tribal area, women go for the morning duties in in the field. Now, while they grow there, they bring the headload of wood from the forest. Now we thought, we interpreted the result time spent on fuel wood, bringing fuel wood, somewhere around 3 hours per day, going, coming back with a load of fuel. Now we interpret it as treachery for women, because they spend too much time. Now, that was our interpretation. Now, how do we reduce the drudgery? Was the answer we were trying to find, make a recommendation to the funding agency. Now, but when we talked to the women, when we presented the result, you know what they said? "Sir, that's the only time we get to socialize among women. How do you call it a drudgery? You are curtailing us from that social get-togethers every morning, share our, sorrows and good things." See, the interpretation difference, the data is the same. One is our perspective, another is their perspective. Now, whose perspective matter is the question. That's an important question one has to consider. Okay.
Yes.
I'm
Yes.
just
Yes.
giving an example of that.
That's a very nice example, sir. Very nice. So I'll move to the next question. How construction of questions can be changed as per the methodology, that is questionnaire, interview schedule, semi-structured interview schedule. This was asked by the participant.
I didn't follow the question. I'm sorry.
I
Can
think
you?
there is how construction of questions can be changed as per the methodology. Like
No,
if we are missing something, huh?
see, first we decide what information we need.
Hmm.
Okay. How do we get that information is the next question. There are several ways of getting the information. Okay. Even secondary data can be used to answer some questions also. You need not necessarily use a questionnaire. But what happens is I already talked about the survey instruments, interviews, questionnaire design. These are two major things. In questionnaire design, you have group administered questionnaires, individual household drop-ins, and other things. These are determined based on the with considering the administrative costs, accessibilities, and so many other factors. And sometimes, it's surveyed is a very costly, very time consuming, but very specific. You can meet your data requirements for specific objectives according to your needs. And that's when, you decide whether to go for a semi-structured questionnaire, structured questionnaire, these kind of thing. Sometimes we have conducted interviews, just with no objectives in my mind. We go, we start talking to the people. The questions arise out of that whole situation. We explore those things in depth, in an open-ended question type. So it all depends on the situation. We cannot say that I am going to sit in the office and say, I'm going to use a semi-structured interview, semi-structured this one, or structured this one. I'm going to use this or that. It all, and often you have to modify as you go. If you're, there are several times you realize that this is not yielding what we are intended to. We have to sometimes, redesign it and rework it. There is no way I can give you a formula that in these circumstances use this.
Yes, sir.
It's
So
not the
it,
individual researcher.
yeah. So it is mandatory for us to go in the survey area to develop a good questionnaire, and we have to keep on modifying it
Yeah,
every time we find
it's
new
a
things. Yeah.
iterative process actually.
Yes. Yes.
You keep on. This time, if you can't, you learn from your mistake. Next research, you try to correct it.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. So last question. Can social scientists protect their questionnaire or schedule by IPR? If yes, then which IPR is appropriate to protect?
To my knowledge, in academics, I have shared every questionnaire that I have. This one. In academics, I don't think there is IPR. In private sector, where there is a profit kind of situation, it may be necessary to protect your questionnaire by IPR. I have this. That's the knowledge I have. I am sorry, I cannot be very.
And that's okay. Huh?
Yeah,
That's okay, sir.
that's my
So the
personal opinion. I'm talking about.
yes. So thank you so much, sir. There are many questions, but we will put those questions in your mail and to later answer those. Sir wants to ask some question.
Yeah.
No, yes, Sunil. Dr. Sam, please decide. Yes, sir. Sir,
So,
there is no question.
I can't hear.
sir, you are not audible.
Yes.
I think your that headphone is not plugged in.
Mine.
Yes, sir.
Is it so? Maybe just yes. Smith, मेरा headphone.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Right.
Uh, Sir, Dr. Pundir, it's my pleasure also to share whatever little I know. Okay. The thing is, people don't spend enough in developing their methodologies. Not only just questionnaire. I'm talking now in general.
Mm.
Uh, the more meticulous you are in developing methodologies in the way of for research, spend more time there. That's what my advice is. You are in a hurry to collect data. I've seen this any number of times. People want data, large amount of data. I'm doing my research is this much. I collect this, but I want to publish papers. Let me collect another little bit more data in this questionnaire, in this one. This is the kind of thing they spend less time thinking to identify the critical most data that they need in order to meet their objectives. Without that, they cannot complete the research. That's what they should concentrate on. I think 70% of the effort should go into identify the relevant data that they need to meet their objectives. And often it is, they simply jump into the questionnaire design. 80% of the data is simply, I classify as junk, and 25% becomes 20 to 25 critical. And that is not sufficient to meet the objective. But you somehow, you have spent so much time, you want to finish it, you try to write it up, you just do, we can't do the proper job.
Right, sir.
Yeah. So I'm sorry that that's my, whether it's PhD students I've seen,
It
my
is
students,
everywhere.
I've said, until you finish this methodology, data collection is the least of botherations. If you take cautions about the content and wording, and you can do this one. But in order to get through that, your theoretical constructs, operationalizing it to something that is doable, from theory to practice, that is that transition from theory to practice is something that is very, very poor, I have observed.
Right, sir. So it is everywhere with every researcher, I think.
Yeah.
There are only few people who are taking into consideration these things.
Yeah.
And
I'm talking
data
about
collection,
only in social sciences. Please,
yes, sir.
I'm not going to go beyond that, but I'm
Right.
talking in social sciences.
Data collection is also a crucial part, but we forget about other crucial things also, like questionnaire development and thinking about the hypothesis and objective every time, and then making corrections in that.
Yeah.
But thank you so much, sir.
You're
How
welcome.
beautifully you have explained everything. Like it was like we are sitting in the class and listening to you. It was a very beautiful lecture, sir. Thank you so much
Thank you so
to
much.
be with us.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
For the participants, our next session is from 10 o'clock tomorrow in the morning, and the fourth session is from 3 p.m.
Okay, that's on sampling.
Yes, sir. That's on sampling, and Dhandapani sir is going to take that.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right.